Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Romina Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. How are you, Tim?
I am good with all of our heat wave here and 111-degree heat forecast for a few days from now.
Oh, wow. We're only at about 101. So that's 7 degrees. I can't imagine it even being hotter than now. But anyway, you have been following the legislative session, which ended last week, and there's some housing bills. Very interesting.
Well, it was, as always, this kind of end of session period is usually dominated by, well, what bill can we pass to increase government control even more, increase taxes even more, increase the state dictating what you can and can't do even more? Well, there was actually a pretty good set of bills that passed, AB 2011 and SB 6, that streamline some of the requirements for building residential housing in basically commercial and retail areas. And the thinking being, as we have this rapid transition with the future of work and people aren't coming back to offices after the pandemic, these kind of older commercial and retail areas are really primed to have, office buildings and retail buildings either converted into housing or tear them down and build them on the plots. But as I write this week on the blog, they were certainly bright spots of a very bad end of session. But they could have been brighter because to get these bills through the legislature, you had to cater to special interests who were blocking them. And in this case, it's, of course, the unions, because the building trades union didn't like one of the bills because they wanted to have the prevailing wage and all these union requirements in them. And so basically, what happened was the legislators' leadership agreed to move both bills forward. So basically, potential builders of these types of projects, I guess, could choose whatever scheme works best for them. But the cost of doing that and the cost of kind of liberating these necessary projects from all the bureaucracy of CEQA and everything is having to pay more. Kerry Jackson has written about prevailing wage before. It's estimated that can add 46% to the cost of a project. You have this push for, some of the housing to get these streamlined rules should be affordable housing. Well, as the legislative analyst has written, really, the push should be for all kinds of housing, because when you have all kinds of market rate housing, it invariably reduces rents and mortgages and prices on other kinds of housing. And also, over time, this new housing is going to be old housing that's going to be more affordable. And the kind of the last thing that's kind of the overarching view of these sorts of bills is they obviously didn't listen to our Chris Carr, who has argued that we shouldn't be giving these sorts of one-off CEQA exemptions and streamlinings for, projects that are important. We should summon the courage to make the tough choices about the across-the-board changes that need to be made to California Environmental Quality Act and get rid of these roadblocks across the board that are holding up critical priorities, not just housing, but wildfire prevention and bike lanes and all these other priorities. So yes, they're a step in the right direction, but they could have been more of a step in the right direction were it not for the kind of usual back and forth here in Sacramento. Now, homelessness, of course, was another big issue in the back of mind, in the end of session here. And Ro, I know you've been following kind of I don't know if interesting is the right word, maybe unique proposal in Los Angeles about housing, homelessness that will be coming to a ballot near you soon.
Well, Tim, talk about a zillion steps backward. So this is Los Angeles's latest idea to house our 60,000 plus homeless in the area. So there's a measure that will go to voters in March 2024, which will require Los Angeles hotels to report their vacancies before 2 p.m. to the government, and the hotels will be required to house a homeless who will have a voucher at the market price of the hotel. Can you imagine this? It'll scare off all of the hotel visitors. What if you had children? Would you really want them in the hallways and the elevators of people who might have mental issues or maybe on drugs? Or many of the homeless have mental issues. That's a fact. And they need care. They just can't be housed in a hotel. And by the way, these hotels could be as on the lower end, like Motel 6, or on the super higher end, like the Ritz-Carlton. They'll all be required to do this. As a business traveler, as a female business traveler, why would I want to stay at a hotel where I think there might be homeless people who are mentally ill or who are on drugs or who are inebriated? It's a crazy thing to do. And it's just too bad because Los Angeles before COVID had gone through tremendous revitalization. There are lots of fun things going on pre-COVID. Now there's a lot less activity, and this will just make it worse.
Well, imagine you have by the convention center, all those downtown hotels, you spend money to have a big convention or trade show in town. And, who shows up at your luncheon? Some homeless guy off the street who's wandering through your hotel and now is terrorizing your guests and eating your food. I mean, it's really, I think will discourage even more people having conventions or business meetings downtown, because who wants to deal with that? And then the thought of, think of the very luxurious hotels, the Hollywood Roosevelt and all of the JW Marriott, all these big fancy hotels at LA Live and downtown. You're really going to have these hotels that are landmark hotels. We're going to turn them into homeless shelters? I mean, it just doesn't seem to make any sense.
No, it doesn't. But that is a city of the angels for you, Tim.
Well, you definitely would need hazard pay if you're the maid, I suppose.
Well, for our next guest, we have Steve Greenhut, who has traditionally come on year after year to discuss the end of session legislation. Got him back again. Steve Greenhut, as many of our listeners know, is a fellow with the Pacific Research Institute. He's also going to be running our Free City Center project, which is to look into the problems of cities. Steve is also with the R Street Institute, a senior fellow there, and he writes for the Southern California News Group, like the Orange County Register and the Los Angeles Daily News. And you also see him on Reason every now and then.
So we go through all the hot bills from the end of session. We're still catching up on the sleep from the late nights following everything for you. But we go through it all, so you don't have to listen and pay attention. So you'll hear on everything from, the push for zero cash bail to the very controversial bill about franchises and farm workers. So you hear it all, and then we do a little preview of what's to come next year from the legislature. So we hope you enjoy.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Steve.
Yeah, great to be here.
So let's jump right in here and start with perhaps the most high-profile bill at the end of the session, AB 257, which would create a new government council to set wage and working conditions for workers at franchises. Now, a lot of people have argued that not only could this speed the push to automation in fast food restaurants and take away jobs, but increase food costs at restaurants. What's your take on this debate? The legislature seems to go out of its way to attack entrepreneurs. And is all of this just more big government?
Yeah, I mean, it really is big government. You would think that after the disaster that was Assembly Bill 5, which was the last so-called landmark labor bill, which essentially banned independent contracting, and had enormous repercussions. You would think that the legislature would maybe think through things a little more before they start passing these landmark labor bills. And this bill would institute something called sectoral bargaining. And the New York Times says it's when workers and employers negotiate compensation working conditions on an industry-wide basis, as opposed to your typical bargaining where workers negotiate with individual companies at individual locations. So that's really a far-reaching, almost European-style approach to the situation in the fast food industry. And I think it will certainly accelerate the move to all these kiosks that we see, the that don't use employees at all, and from what I've read, there was one report that said it will probably increase cost. About 30% of the new costs will be passed on to consumers, and it's just kind of a crazy way to do it. So you'll have a state-run committee that has half made up of workers and half made up of business interests, and then a couple state employees who would, of course, probably knowing the leanings of our legislature, would end up siding with the workers. And we could see, hourly wage rates pushing up to $22 an hour. They put some limits on some of the areas that they could intervene in, but that's just for now. I mean, we're just going to see a state government panel telling franchise employees just dictating the terms of employment. So, and also the fast food industry sees this as a potential model around the country. So they're really upset about it.
Well, I was talking with somebody about this bill yesterday, and they made the point that one of these working conditions they could impose, maybe they could decide you can't have kiosks in the restaurants, and certainly issues about like meal and break periods and all of that. Could you have restaurants open from they can only be open from 8 to 6? So it's really very far reaching of what it could be. So labor, of course, has been flexing their muscles a lot this session. And there was another very high profile bill where they flexed their muscles. And that was AB 2183. And that bill really, it's the UFW, the United Farm Workers, responding to their defeat in the famous Gowan case, which is, seemingly the latest example of a union getting their allies in the legislature to flex their muscles on their behalf. So maybe give a little bit of background of, what was the Gowan case, but also share your thoughts on what seems to be, to me, a really unseemly bill aimed at farm workers who had the guts to stand up to the UFW and tell them no. And do you think Governor Newsom will sign the bill this time around? He vetoed it in the last incarnation.
Yeah, the Gowan Farms case was really infuriating. In fact, I went to the Agricultural Labor Relations Board and watched while they were discussing it. So essentially, the UFW had organized Gowan Farms in the Fresno area years ago, and then in 1990, and then they basically abandoned. They abandoned it. They just disappeared from the scene. And in 2013. The workers finally had an election. They wanted to decertify. It was whether to decertify this union at the UFW, which apparently wasn't doing anything to benefit the workers there. And the ALRB just sat on the vote. So it's just what I remember. A lot of the details are hazy at this point, but they wouldn't count the votes. And when I was at the ALRB hearing, busloads of workers had come in and they were really frustrated. And in fact, Gowan had paid some of the highest wages in the industry. And imagine that you have a government agency that just refuses to count the votes. And so we had a series of court cases. The ALRB, their administrative law judge, and that's one of those things that always drives me nuts. Administrative law judges really are just, they work for the agency. So they sided with the union, and ultimately, and the state passed a law that would have allowed the ALRB to simply impose a labor contract on the workers. Finally went to court, got to the state Supreme Court. They counted the ballots, and the workers had overwhelmingly rejected the union. They had voted to decertify the union. So now the legislature is, coming back and just doing the UFW's bidding, and that just seems really unseemly to me and pretty undemocratic when you get down to it. Now I saw that I was reading a piece here where the governor's office said, "Governor, this is their statement. The governor's eager to sign legislature that expands opportunity for ag workers." Blah blah blah. but that they didn't like the aspects where it would be a mail-in election here, which I think would be really ripe for tampering, an all-mail election. So it looks to me like the governor will probably veto that bill, but since he's made it pretty clear that he has problems with it, and he had vetoed a bill, was it last year, or that had done a similar thing. But I think the legislature ought not to be just advocating for one particular union and putting their thumbs on the scale. And they talk about the whole state. I forget the name of the act, but the initial act that Jerry Brown had signed that was meant to give workers in the field a voice. Yet when their voice isn't what the state wants, and when they want to say something the state doesn't want to hear, then they intervene and they take away that right. It was one of the more outrageous cases that I had.
So this session was also big on housing reform and trying to overcome the log jams created by CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act, which holds up housing and construction and increases cost. The biggest reforms that passed this session were AB 2011 and SB 6, both of which were nearly held up over a dispute between the labor unions. So what's your view on these bills? Is this what's needed to jumpstart new housing? And is this so-called deal between labor unions really just going to add to housing costs in the end?
Yeah, this is always the problem we face is, sometimes the state will, on housing especially, will have some good ideas. And I think it's a good idea to make it easier for developers to build on retail sites. I mean, we have the retail industry's gone through a dramatic change. There are a lot of vacant malls and shopping centers, and we're having a housing crunch. And I think the basic genesis of it is a good idea. And I was reading from some housing organization, some local control kind of NIMBY group, and they called these bills, like one of the bills, like the worst, the worst bill of the year. And it, because it does all the kind of things that I like, this group called Livable California, AB 2011 could be the worst bill of 2022 because it takes away local control. Well, funny how a lot of groups, they use local control when it benefits them, and then they impose it when it doesn't. But object to the fact that it circumvents CEQA and that it reduces parking requirements. And these are all things. I mean, these are things I like. I think that the existing system of parking requirements can be ridiculous. I mean, you try to build any project. I know at our church we were trying to do a minor upgrade, and the parking requirements were so extreme in the county that we gave up on it. The city of Sacramento, they eliminated a lot of the parking requirements, so it's much easier to build things. And of course, CEQA is nonsense. It just allows anybody to file lawsuits to slow down projects, and it creates these bills create by right development, just like SB 9 and 10. It gives you the right by right to build a project provided you meet the basic standards. So these two bills would do the same thing. But then, of course, on the other hand, is the state gets involved and they impose so many conditions, labor conditions, unionization, project labor agreement type conditions, and requirements for affordable subsidized housing, that then you have to analyze whether is it more good than bad or more bad than good. And I'm not totally sure yet. I like the concept, but then you had the two different labor groups fighting the affordable housing groups over the competing bills. So as I understand it, both bills are moving forward. And then if they're signed into law, the developer would get to choose under which extremely aggressive conditions they want to live under. So I like the concept, but even when California legislators have a good concept, the unions get involved, all the different groups that take subsidies get involved, and we never end up with a very clean kind of deregulatory bill that we would like. I thought that SB 9 and SB 10, which had passed and became law previously, that allowed by right development of duplexes and single family neighborhoods. I thought thought those were as simple as we could ever get. Where these two bills, I think, are a lot more they're a lot more problematic, and we'll have to look at it. But there are a lot of new requirements being imposed on builders who want to take advantage of these looser standards.
So another very controversial bill this session has been Governor Newsom's push, and certainly in the name of California's transition to green energy, to extend the lifetime of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. That's SB 846, and that plant is scheduled to go offline in a couple of years. But of course, then we realized we need the power for the state grid. So, with this bill, do you think that Newsom and environmental advocates are finally waking up to the reality that you really do need nuclear power to have 100% renewable future? Or is this really more about kind of the politics of 2022 and maybe beyond for Governor Newsom?
Yeah, I think the governor has been trying to take a few more moderate stances, or at least, trying with water, with this bill here, so that, it wouldn't look good to run for president with the lights off and water rationing rampant. I think I agree. I think it's like a tacit admission that this, with the state's aggressive climate targets, and the state's much better at shutting down existing electricity generation than making it easy for new generation to come on board. So they seem to put limits on what's existing before they're able to come up with new ways to produce electricity. So with different electricity cutbacks, the problems PG&E has been having. I think Governor Newsom's smart enough to remember Gray Davis and the rolling electricity blackouts. If you want to get people mad, start shutting off the electricity and the spigots, and that's going to have impact at the pole. So this would just extend the life of Diablo Canyon, which I think was in 2016, where there was the deal to decommission it, and they were going to use renewables, and those haven't come about as quickly as possible. Here I was reading it was an agreement with environmental and labor groups to close the plant and replace it with a whole array of renewables and energy efficiency. They never consider diminishing returns, and community choice energy programs, which we've seen like at Orange County, that none of those promises of this public energy have really come about. They ought to wait for the state ought to wait for the new promised forms of electricity to come online before they decommission older forms of electricity. So good idea. Keep it running. We need the electricity.
So another high profile push this session has been an effort to regulate social media content targeting kids. Now, the most high profile bill on this, AB 2408, was killed in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, or the Senate Appropriations Committee, a few weeks ago. But lawmakers did succeed in passing two other bills with lesser teeth. So what are your thoughts on this effort, this session, which seems to be a rare effort where you saw some bipartisan cooperation? And have social media companies really gone too far in their appeal to kids that they can expect a renewed and even stronger effort in this area by lawmakers next session?
Yeah, I was really troubled by, especially the original bill. So it passed the full assembly 51-0. 27 members didn't vote, but still, and it's just one of those for the children votes. So it's called the Social Media Platform Duty to Children Act. And when you hear the duty to children, my hackles go up. I mean, if the state legislature felt a duty to children, they might do something about the state's public school system. But this mainly would have the original form would have allowed anyone that used the private attorney right of action to sue the social media companies if they claim that their children were addicted to the apps and the programs. I'm addicted to my phone. How do you prove that? And then later it it removed that clause and allowed it, the lawsuits to be, by the state attorney general and district attorneys. But it wouldn't take much in this state for some politically motivated, go figure, district attorney to file a lawsuit against Facebook. And how are they going to prove this? And it just seemed, I can't believe that some Republicans supported this. I mean, it's just, maybe I can believe it, given some of the things they're doing at the national level on tech firms, kind of a movement on the right against tech firms. But it just seemed like a nightmare in the waiting. So it's good that measure went down to defeat. I mean, it shows that sometimes some really bad legislation will die.
So let's look ahead to next year on a few items of unfinished business. First, thanks to the efforts of PRI President Sally Pipes, supporters of single-payer legislation were forced to throw in the towel. But there's no doubt that it'll come back with a vengeance. So what does your crystal ball tell you about the potential for another push for single-payer in 2023?
Yeah, it's going to keep coming back because it's such a big part, of the progressive agenda. But we saw, when the bill died this year, it didn't even come up for a vote. So Democrats are deathly afraid of it having to go on the record to vote for it. So if they vote against single payer, they will incur the wrath of their progressive base. But if they do vote for it, it's a pretty big target from Republicans. I think even the states politicians understand that tossing the entire private healthcare system into the wastebasket and, starting over again is at best, just a very dangerous idea. And, we see how other state agencies look at the Employment Development Department and how many tens of billions of dollars did they lose? And our state agencies are largely incompetent. They're overly bureaucratic. So do we really want to turn, healthcare over to them? Sally's done a great job documenting the horrors that would ensue if we did that. So, but I think it's going to keep coming back. I remember, was it SB 400? I believe that was the name of the bill, and it was a few years ago, and it was a real bare bones. That was the first effort on single payer, and it was it wasn't many pages at all. So they were going to just toss out the entire healthcare system that we have now and replace it with something to be determined in the future. And I think it passed the Senate. So, but I also think, and then Anthony Rondon in the Assembly, he killed it, and he was one of the few that at least spoke out and said this is crazy to do this. And then the costs were estimated to be, it's more than the entire state budget. So we don't have the money for that, even with the massive surpluses, and those surpluses are no doubt going to be diminishing as stock market might fall and the recession could be looming, and we're highly dependent on capital gains. So there's not the money to do it, and I think even the progressive lawmakers know that they're playing with fire. But I think it'll keep coming back, and that's what scares me. Someday something will pass, and then we're off to the races, and that's a really bad idea.
So, of course, all these bills we're talking about are overshadowed by California's fiscal health. And yes, we enacted a record $300 billion state budget in June. Yet since then, capital gains taxes are surely going to fall, and perhaps dramatically, because of the decline in the stock market that we've seen, and could continue to decline as we're in or teetering on the brink of a recession. So what's the thinking that you're hearing around the Capitol about the state of California's budget? Are we in for a real budget mess next year?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell. I mean, the legislative analyst's office says we might get as much as $25 billion less than anticipated. We could get more than that, but there's certainly our capital gains dependent budget is dependent on the stock market. So as much as our Democratic legislators hate Wall Street, their whole program is entirely dependent on Wall Street and its success. So it's a little bit ironic. The surplus was absurdly high, $97.5 billion. So even if it's lower than that, it's still a surplus. Tim and I, we remember those days with Jerry Brown and the $30 billion budget deficit. In my experience, the only time anything good happens in this state is when there are tough budgetary times, because then it forces our profligate legislators to make some hard choices, and they don't like to make hard choices. So back then, of course, sometimes the choices they make are terrible. So back then, the governor put to the people, and in their foolishness, they approved a tax increase. But the governor Brown did eliminate redevelopment agencies, which had siphoned like $13 billion a year from the state, because the state had to backfill all these crony capitalist deals that the local redevelopment agencies funded. But at least at the time, we also got PEPRA, the public employee, the Pension Reform Act, Public Employees Pension of 2012. Anyway, I think went into effect in 2013. That reformed pensions, although modestly, at least there was some effort back then to deal with the pension debt. And we're going to start, the pensions have been pretty well funded because of the stock market boom. But if the stock market starts falling, then the state's pension obligations are going to go up. And even after the stock market rise, the pension funds still aren't funded adequately. And we have a long-term problem. And this governor has put a few more $1 billion towards funding them, but there's been no effort to reform our pension system. So we do those things. The state addresses some of these ongoing problems only when we have to. So now that we have a huge surplus, we're just spending like crazy. And I believe the state's missing a key opportunity, to upgrade our infrastructure, to really seriously fix things, this is the time to fix our tax structure and make it less dependent on capital gains taxes. These were ideas that were long tossed about back in the days of budget deficits. And then there was the discussion that we need more money to be able to make some of these long-term and fundamental structural fixes. And now we have the money, and instead we're just the state government is just spending money like crazy. And those deficits, those surpluses are going to start falling almost certainly. And then the state maybe will have to make some harder choices. I don't like to wish bad economic times on anyone, but something has to force the state to be a little more responsible in how it spends its money, at least theoretically.
So, Steve, we talked a lot about a lot of bills here, but you've been following some others. What important bills are out there that we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, well, one thing I noticed was, the governor vetoed, safe injection site legislation, which was that would have allowed pilot programs in San Francisco, LA, and I think a few more cities. And that was he's gotten a lot of brickbats from his progressive side, and I think that's a indicator of at least Newsom trying to come across building a slightly more moderate image as he at least potentially eyes a run for the presidency. So there was that. His water proposal, which really doesn't require legislative work, but his water proposal, it's the first time in a long time that a governor has talked about building infrastructure, increasing supply, promoting desalination. Now, I will point out that a major desalination was ready to go. The Coastal Commission that had included a number of his appointees had unanimously rejected that. So there are definitely nits to pick in his plan, but at least he's talking about water abundance. So it is true with this governor. He talks about a lot of things, and he doesn't always follow through. So So I think that the context of him potentially running for president has maybe tempered some of his decision making, and we'll see how that plays out next year.
Maybe he read Winning the Water War.
Oh yeah, good chance.
So I would say, just to, kind of cap our discussion here, one interesting thing that I've been following that really has been simmering in the background since July is the speakership fight. Now, for our listeners who haven't been following it, we've had redistricting this year. We've had we've set the stage for an incredible turnover in the legislature in November. About a third of the legislature is going to be new, with people opting to run for other offices, or they've been defeated, or they've just decided they've had enough and are hanging it up. So in that context, you've had Speaker Anthony Rendon, who's been in the speaker a while, and after a while, people get a little restless, and they're all ambitious. They wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and see a speaker or a governor or a president. So Assemblyman Robert Rivas from Hollister launched a leadership challenge, seemingly, in July. And there was this weird kind of Democratic caucus meeting right before the 4th of July recess where they all sat around, and there was a lot of smoke, a lot of in and out, but you didn't see the white smoke, but a lot of back and forth. And Rivas calls himself the choice of the majority of the Democratic caucus, but we haven't had that traditional backslapping, here's our new leader, and I'm happy to pass the baton between Rendon and Rivas. And the key thing is that the Assembly has not taken a vote to elect Mr. Rivas as Speaker. So that's a real sign that he probably does not have 41 votes to be the Speaker. So the drama now will be, well, what's going to happen in the election? Because the people who might have favored Mr. Rivas now, well, some of them aren't going to be around post-November. And also for Mr. Rendon, some of his folks will be leaving. So which of these folks will be elected Speaker? Or maybe it's somebody else. So there's a lot of drama to play out this fall in the elections. Who wins could determine who is Speaker, one or the other, or someone else.
Yeah, it's a fascinating backstory, right? And I didn't see any great ideological battle there, but usually, what is it? If you aim for the king, you better not miss, and he seemed to have missed. So we'll see what happens.
And there's been a lot of public posturing, and they said, well, we have these regular meetings now, but they're not transition meetings, but they're discussion meetings. But I think it was sort of a face-saving move, really, to say, what's going on one way or the other. But, if you don't have 41 votes, you're not the Speaker. That's really all about math. And I know with our prior budget discussions, they don't do much math, but really it comes down to, do you have 41?
It's best to announce it after you really do.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Steve. And our listeners should know that Steve is going to be running PRI's Free Cities Center, and we'll be launching that in September. And so please look out for it. It's a great project. We'll be following the cities across the Western states and trying to reform them and restore the greatness of our cities. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.